Who was dabbing before it was cool, before even Kamen Rider in 1971? Giant Robo. But what is Giant Robo? Well, he can be described in a few different ways. He's one of Mitsuteru Yokoyama's many stories in The Boy and His Robot mold of Tetsujin 28. He's Toei's first giant robot, predating the super mecha craze started by Mazinger Z in the early 70s, and was rocking red-tipped finger missiles years before the finger missiles of Mechagodzilla, something that would receive a nod in Gunbuster decades later. And finally, he's the subject of one of the best works to come out of the OVA boom of late 20th century Japan. A work that would inspire moments in media like The Idolmaster and Teen Titans. Still, for a series that occupies a fairly notable, if not influential place in the histories of manga, anime, and tokusatsu, it doesn't get a whole lot of attention. And for a relatively small and obscure series, it's weirdly complicated. Like, it's all called Giant Robo, but each version is almost completely different from the next. Just about the only thing they all have in common is the male character and his robot at the center of it. And even those elements can vary a lot. There's a lot to unpack here. So, come with me on this journey through the 20th century history of Giant Robo, and we'll start at the very beginning. But first, a word from our sponsor.
この都市はパスワードを盗み、個人情報を漏らしている巨大なウイルスに攻撃されています。どうすれば止められるのでしょうか。
私の名前はみやこで IIPN のキャプテンです。あまりにも多くの人が公共の Wi-Fi を保護せずに使用しており、今ではウイルスを人間が止めることはできません。
ウイルスは制御不能です。
私たちは何かをしなければなりません。
ノルド VPN が唯一の希望です。
ワンクリックで全ての市民を避難させましょう。今す
ぐ。もうパスワードを失うことはありません。
誰もがプライバシーの権利を持っています。
オンライン脅威対策を今すぐ開始しましょう。
マルウェアのスキャンを開始します。
キャプテン、ポップアップ広告が多すぎる。
それら全てをブロックします。
ウイルスが増殖し、私たちのシステムをシャットダウンしようとしています。
一度に6台のデバイスにダウンロードします。
NordVPN.com/Bluenava で NordVPN の独占契約を取得してください。ノールの30日間の返金保証によりリスクがありません。
The year was 1965. Over the past 10 years and then some, Toho Studios had wowed the world with special effects features like Godzilla, Rodan, Mothra, and Atragon. These had been extravagant pictures known the world over, arguably Japan's most famous exports in their day. However, come the mid-60s, the virtual monopoly Toho held over the giant monster movie-making business had crumbled. 1962's King Kong vs. Godzilla, which remains one of the biggest films in Japanese history, was the height of Toho's reign, and 1965's Monster Zero, the last monster film to finish in the top 10 highest-grossing films of his year, for ages to come, was the end. Did this mean the end of Tokusatsu? Not even close. Daiei Studios introduced the first legitimate competition to Toho's monster features with the Gamera series starting in 1965, films made with less money than Toho's big-budgeted spectacles, and the Daimajin series in 1966, a trilogy which rivaled the artistry of Toho's films. The former series would eventually hit its stride appealing to children, and the latter courted more mature audiences, though things were only getting heated up. Come 1967, fans had a wide assortment of theatrical tokusatsu to choose from. That year saw the release of Son of Godzilla, Gamera vs. Gyaos, The X from Outer Space, King Kong Escapes, and Gappa the Triphibian Monster. The year even saw South Koreans try their hand at the genre with contributions like Space Monster Wagamangawe and Yangari, Monster from the Deep. However, Toho's greatest competition came from television, which for years had been stealing audiences away from the theater at an alarming rate, and, in the very near future, would supplant the movie theater as the dominant market of not only tokusatsu, but entertainment as a whole, and do so for decades to come. Ironically enough, one of the figures leading the charge on the television front was the special effects wizard responsible for bringing Godzilla and Toho's other monsters to life in the first place, Eiji Tsuburaya. His newfound studio, Tsuburaya Productions, unleashed the Ultra series upon Japan in 1966 with the black and white monster mystery show, Ultra Q, the show responsible for the boom in the first place. Ultra Q was a significant technical achievement. It was the first giant monster show to truly challenge the quality of Toho's theatrical features, and it's what triggered the previously mentioned wave of kaiju cinema. But the future of entertainment was television, and the influence of Ultra Q's enormous success had an equally profound, if not greater effect, on that medium. Almost instantly, TV screens across the nation were filled with colorful characters like Ambassador Magma, Monster Prince, and Lightspeed Esper. The absolute peak of the Ultra series' popularity, and arguably the boom altogether, was Ultraman in late 1966, which followed the adventures of a hero from the stars who helped a special attack team defend the Earth from enemies, earthbound and alien alike. The show achieved a record 42% audience viewership rating at its height in early 1967. These were nothing short of astonishing numbers, and in its wake, Japanese popular culture would never be the same. So where does Giant Robo factor into all of this? Well, what set the series on the course for greatness was Toei Studios, and its desire to capitalize on the Tokusatsu boom. Although Toei had dabbled in Tokusatsu several times before, its mid-60s push represented a completely new level of commitment that laid the foundations for the Tokusatsu people still recognize the studio for today. October 1966 saw Toei's return to television Tokusatsu with an adaptation of the yokai manga Akuma-kun. The successful show starred Mitsunobu Kaneko, the future boy actor of Giant Robo, and while the show primarily revolved around human-sized threats, it had its fair share of giants as well. Arguably, it can be viewed as Toei's Ultra Q, and Giant Robo would be its Ultraman. One a black and white mystery series, and the other series about a giant that helps an attack team fight monsters. But what gets us to Giant Robo as we know it today had almost nothing to do with giant monsters at all. No, it was a little ninja boy. First, a little context. The success of Daiei Shinobi no Mono series helped to spark a mid-60s ninja fad that saw ninjas flood both TV and the silver screen. Toei's most significant contribution to this movement was its 1966 live-action adaptation of Watari, the Ninja Boy, a ninja manga series by Sanpei Shirato. The manga was known for its social commentary and depiction of discrimination, all things Toei removed in favor of a simple entertainment vehicle. Nevertheless, double billed with a Cyborg 009 film, Toei's Watari adaptation was a hit and was to be the backdoor pilot for a TV show. But extremely dissatisfied with the film, Shirato revoked the rights to Watari and swore to never work with Toei again, leaving the studio without material for a show already in production. Needing a replacement and fast, Toei turned to Mitsuteru Yokoyama, a manga artist who was at the time best known for the very popular Tetsujin 28, a 1956 manga that can be considered the origin of the mecha genre, at least as mecha is recognized today. Anyway, Toei had previously relied on him for a ninja manga, and Yokoyama was willing to provide them with another. The result was Akagage, something Toei turned into a monster fighting drama to capitalize on the monster boom since 1. They were basically starting from scratch, and 2. Yokoyama didn't mind liberal adaptations of his work. But what matters here is what came out of Toei's request. While Toei producer Toru Hirayama was paying Yokoyama a visit to settle the details on their new ninja series, he noticed an image of a giant robot and was instantly enamored. The image, of course, was of Giant Robo, the title character of a manga Yokoyama was working on with Satoru Ozawa of Blue Submarine No. 6 fame, a manga which today is probably best recognized for its late 90s OVA. But, more importantly, we've reached Giant Robo. Giant Robo, in manga form, tells the story of Daisaku Kusama, a college-aged youth who, following a series of unfortunate events, winds up in possession of Giant Robo, or GR1, a nuclear-powered robot which can only be operated by his voice. Giant Robo was to be the trump card of BF, or Big Fire, a terrorist group plotting world domination. And, with their ultimate weapon now gone, BF goes to great lengths to reclaim it. Consequently, Daisaku, having joined the United Nations Special Agency, uses Giant Robo to fight off the other BF mechs and protect the world. Although the Giant Robo manga could be described as a cross between the 007 films at the time and Yokoyama's own Tetsujin 28, Hirayama saw potential for something else. He had been interested in producing an Ultraman or Godzilla of his own, and felt this character was the perfect chance to make that happen. But the special effects team at Toei saw things differently. Having already worked on 2 Tokusatsu shows that very year, they were not thrilled about the prospect of another. As learned with the previous shows, Tokusatsu was a costly venture, and Giant Robo, with an emphasis on giant-on-giant action set in the modern world, would be by far the most ambitious of the Toei productions yet. Still, Hirayama was determined to see this through, even if it meant significantly cutting corners. If Toho and Tsuburaya could make giant monster media, so could Toei. And so, Hirayama got his answer to the monster boom. The Giant Robo manga was first published in the May 14, 1967 issue of Weekly Shonen Sunday, where it gained a decent following. Giant Robo, the Toku series, hit TV screens on October 11, 1967, though, as alluded to earlier, the show was not exactly a faithful adaptation. It took countless liberties with the source material, and the most notable of those liberties include 1. Changing its lead character into a preteen, which the manga, without acknowledgement or explanation, actually preempted by doing a month before the show's premiere. A move likely made to reflect and target those who were becoming the primary audience of the genre, children. 2. Introducing the signature wristwatch Daisaku uses to control Giant Robo. In the manga, he either shouted if close enough, or gave commands from a special location. 3. Retooling Big Fire into alien invaders led by Emperor Guillotine. Guillotine is supported by a group of colorful generals and an army of henchmen decked in stylish uniforms that looks like Cuban Marxist meets SS officer. 4. Switching the heroes from UN secret agents to Unicorn, something more akin to a Ultra Series monster attack team. And 5. Almost entirely replacing the handful of robot enemies of the manga, those being GR Models 2 and 3, and Giant Stingrays, with a collection of more unique enemies, consisting primarily of giant monsters. Only GR2 survived, at least in some form, the translation from page to screen. Otherwise, the show featured enemies such as corrosive liquid, and disembodied body parts like mechanical hands or jaws, and a yokai eye. Even the men-in-suit opponents drew inspiration from sources like Egyptian deities, vampires, and plants, as opposed to the usual reptile influence the genre had been fond of. In short, the only major elements from the manga to reach the TV screen were Daisaku, Giant Robo, and Big Fire. Almost everything else about the show was more Ultramanian in nature. Just look at it. Defense teams, monsters, and a giant silver hero to save the day when the going got too rough. Oh yeah, on that note, Giant Robo and Ultra 7, the latter being the follow-up and spiritual successor of Ultraman, even have a few interesting points in common. Both shows, which debuted together in October 1967, have main characters associated with the number 7. Daisaku Kusama is the 7th member of Unicorn, and Dan Moriboshi, the lead character of Ultra 7, becomes the 7th member of the Ultra Guard whenever he transforms into the title character of his show. But you probably get the idea. Anyway, Toei's take on Giant Robo instantly overtook the manga in popularity, but besides reducing the age of its lead character, the manga mostly remained its own thing, and lasted 2 volumes, ending with the heroes destroying Big Fire's underwater fortress. But that wasn't the end of Giant Robo's run in print form. With the show doing good business, several different manga bearing greater influence from the show were released between fall 1967 and summer 1968. Yokoyama was involved with a few of these in some fashion, but the rest were handled by other artists. Still, none of this could compare to the popularity of the show, so let's take a closer look at the show. As a Tokusatsu series, Giant Robo has an abundance of special effects, and the man tasked with bringing the show's world to life was special effects director Nobuo Yajima. Yajima would go on to become one of the most prominent figures of Japanese special effects, working on everything from Spectrum Man to Metal Heroes. And despite primarily working for Toei, Yajima was involved with Tsuburaya Productions from time to time, directing the special effects for several episodes of Ultraman Taro and Ultraman Leo. Giant Robo was one of Yajima's earliest TV assignments, and one can already see techniques that will become staples of his future output. For example, it's Giant Robo where he'd get familiar with the worm's-eyed view shots that have characters standing on tempered glass to achieve the desired effect, and the subject framed between the leg shots. While he did not invent these shots, an iconic example of one can be found more than a year earlier in Ultraman. Yajima is the figure most associated with them in Tokusatsu. As for the rest of the visuals and effects, there's extensive use of Giant Robo life-size hand props, camera work in the fight scenes involves a lot of outside shooting and handheld photography, and the wire work of the tentacle monsters doesn't look half bad next to Godzilla vs. Biollante, a big-budgeted film from 20 years later. Furthermore, its composite imagery and framing generally compares well to what Tsuburaya Productions offered in the earlier episodes of the original Ultraman, and at times actually better. On the other hand, the concerns of Toei's effects team might have been valid, as the show has its fair share of rough spots. Clumsier miniatures and at times tight framing to hide its limited sets should be easy to forgive. However, there are bewildering lapses in quality control, such as the reuse of footage without regard to whether it matches its new context, and baffling compositing failures. Every once in a while, the effects can go from as good as the best of them to as bad as the worst. A lack of polish and attention to detail not as common in Ultraman, and that gap is only widened with comparisons to Ultra 7, the show Giant Robo shared the air with. Yet, in spite of its technical shortcomings, not to mention flimsy scripting, I still found myself charmed by its touching bond between a boy and his robot, the wholesome chemistry within Unicorn, especially its two leads, Daisuke and Juro Minami, which makes even some of the lesser drama a pleasant watch, and entertaining gun-blazing and monster-fighting action backed by a military and jazz-oriented score. Evidently, quite a few viewers were charmed too, as not only did the show hold its own against the Ultra series, Giant Robo left an undeniable mark in Japanese popular culture. Arguably, without the show, Giant Robo would have fallen into obscurity, not unlike the other Yokoyama boy and his robot stories of the 60s. For example, because of Yokoyama's busy schedule, Satoru Ozawa was the one responsible for a lot of the actual drawing in the beginning. But, due to his own hectic schedule, Ozawa dropped out and left one of Yokoyama's assistants to finish things up. This resulted in an inconsistent art style, and Yokoyama's dissatisfaction led to him allowing the manga to fall out of publication. And so, we're left with the show. While Giant Robo wasn't the first mecha in Tokusatsu, or even the first in TV Tokusatsu, the former distinction is owed to Mogira of the 1957 film, The Mysterians, and the latter distinction belongs to the 1960 TV adaptation of Tetsujin 28. Giant Robo still represents a few important firsts. It was the first mecha TV series in color, and, as an advanced giant robot fighting for justice, it predates the super robot craze and its tropes by several years. Plus, Giant Robo is one of the first examples in Tokusatsu history of heroes calling upon a giant mech to counter monsters summoned by evildoers, a concept Toei would later get plenty of mileage out of with Japanese Spider-Man's Leo Pardon, the title character of Daitetsujin 17, and the various mechs of Super Sentai. So, as mentioned earlier, the Tokusatsu series not only proved popular, it also held its own against Ultra 7. So, what happened? Network executives at NET were so impressed they requested additional episodes. However, Toei lacked the funds to continue. Despite its strong viewership, like Akuma-kun and Captain Ultra before it, Giant Robo was costly to produce, and Toei, having not figured out merchandising yet, could not justify the expense. It would not be until Kamen Rider a few years later that they got a handle on alleviating production costs and outright profiting with merchandise. So, in April 1968, after 26 episodes, Giant Robo ended its run with a bittersweet finale. A finale that left the eyes of producer Hirayama, and undoubtedly many children, filled with tears. Despite financial concerns bringing the show to a quick end by the standards of Tokusatsu television, Hirayama still managed to prove his point. Toei could do what Toho and Tsuburaya Productions could. And, in hindsight, the show ending when it did might have been for the best, as the kaiju boom of the mid-60s had lost much of its steam come 1968. Gamera vs. Gauss was supposed to be the final entry in the Gamera series. Toho had intended for Destroy All Monsters to conclude its work with Godzilla and other giant monsters, and Ultra 7 was meant to end the Ultra series. In fact, in fall of 1968, Eiji Tsuburaya reportedly said, "The era of monsters is over. We have decided to stop the production of Ultra 7 and send it back into space." But just because demand for monsters died down in Japan doesn't mean there weren't opportunities elsewhere. In 1969, American International Television, the television wing of American International Pictures, picked up Giant Robo for Western release, dubbed it, and named it Johnny Sokko and His Flying Robot. A year later, AIP-TV made a compilation film out of 5 Johnny Sokko episodes, entitled it Voyage into Space. Both the show and the film would find a receptive audience. And besides maybe Godzilla and Ultraman, Giant Robo is quite possibly the most successful old-school tokusatsu export. Its spaghetti western style theme is likely to evoke a fond memory in a child of the 60s or 70s. Speaking of which, it's time to return to the land of the rising sun and enter the 70s, as a whole new era of pop culture is on the horizon. Come 1971, inspired by the success of Return of Ultraman and Kamen Rider, a new wave of tokusatsu swept Japan. While a lot of the same talent responsible for bringing Giant Robo to life were still at the helm, and relied on the same tropes, Toei's latest offerings were to be ruled by Shitaro Ishinomori, a mangaka who supplied the studio with a steady stream of hits like Kamen Rider, Kikaider, and Super Sentai, all popular shows that were far less expensive to produce than something like Giant Robo. Still, even before and during the second tokusatsu boom, Giant Robo found success in the form of reruns. It was apparently successful enough to justify the launch of a new tie-in manga and line of merchandise in 1972. Though everything changed come December that same year. The debut of Mazinger Z, a Toei Animation TV series based on a manga by Go Nagai, took Japan by storm and spawned the super robot craze. Shows like Brave Riding, Get a Robo, and the Robot Romance trilogy would arrive in the days to follow, and before long fantastical robots were everywhere. And in a field crowded with new, cheaper to produce mecha and tokusatsu competition, Giant Robo was simply overshadowed. It wouldn't be accurate to say Giant Robo was ever truly forgotten, as it would get acknowledgement in Fight, Our Heroes Great Gathering, a 1976 TV special to celebrate 10 years of Toei heroes, and Giant Robo would also receive an official model kit in 1980 to coincide with the latest adaptation of Tessogen 28. However, with that said, one would not have been remiss in believing that Giant Robo's best days were behind it. It was the mid-80s, and much had changed in the past 10 years or so. Japan was far removed from the heights of Tokusatsu. In fact, the art form had fallen on hard times outside of exceptions like Super Sentai and Metal Heroes. Interest in giant monsters was all but dead. However, anime was a different story. It had only amassed greater influence both abroad and in its homeland since the early 70s. And it was in that medium that Giant Robo would get another chance at life. Enter Yasuhito Yamaki, the chief assistant of producer Yoshinobu Nishizaki. Nishizaki was one of two co-creators of the series responsible for the second anime boom in the late 70s. Space Battleship Yamato. Space Battleship Yamato debuted as a TV series in 1974, and, despite a slow start, would go on to become one of the most iconic anime series ever. After a few seasons and several films, the sci-fi epic concluded with 1983's Final Yamato, but feeling that the series had far too much value to let slumber, Nishizaki almost instantly started working on a follow-up. Dessler's War 1, Battleship Starsha, a Space Battleship Yamato spin-off, was first announced in the Yamato Fan Club magazine in October 1983, and gradually morphed into additional projects such as Yamato Resurrection and New Yamato. The first of these projects was meant to be released in 1985, and naturally, a team was assembled to make the ambitious vision a reality. Yet for reasons not entirely clear, little of this ever saw the light of day, and due to disagreements between its two creators, Space Battleship Yamato would not receive a proper revival until the late 2000s. Nevertheless, wanting to put his hard work to good use, Yamaki redirected his energy to a different idea, and it didn't take long for him to find his new direction.
Head in!
Mecha had been a popular subject in animation since the early 70s, and that popularity had been recently reaffirmed with the success of the Mobile Suit Gundam trilogy in the early 80s, the last installment of which was the fourth highest-grossing Japanese film of 1982. Though this reaffirmation came with a twist. Yoshiyuki Tomino's Mobile Suit Gundam, in addition to reinforcing the second anime boom started by Space Battleship Yamato a few years earlier, spawned the real robot genre. A genre which distinguished itself from the super robot craze by placing greater emphasis on the logistics of piloting or maintaining their behemoth machines, and taking place in a more grounded setting. But of course, it was not Gundam alone that did this. What Gundam started in 1979 was immediately reinforced by the wave of Tomino-directed anime that followed. At the same time, Tomino's push towards realism was supported by the success of director Ryosuke Takehashi's Thing of the Sun Dougram and Armored Trooper Votoms, and before long, real robots took control of the industry. That's not to suggest all things mecha from this period conform to this style, as super robots continued to find success in the 80s. But with gems and hits like Giant Gorg, Blue Comet SPT Lazener, and Metal Armor Dragonar, adherence to some level of realism became the defining trait of the era, and can be seen as late as the end of the decade with properties like Patlabor and the 5-Star Stories. And in this creative landscape, Yamaki yearned for the days of old. Much like how George Lucas and Steven Spielberg deliberately evoked the early 20th century serial films they enjoyed in their youth with Indiana Jones, Yamaki too hoped to honor the things of the past. And this is what puts us on the long road to what will become the next entry in the Giant Robo universe. And I emphasize long road because a lot of pieces had to fall into place to make this OVA happen. It was while working on 1985's Odin Starlight Mutiny, perhaps the only thing of note to come out of the initial effort to revive Yamato, that Yamaki received a game-changing revelation. During said production, Super Dimension Fortress Macross, Do You Remember Love, hit theaters on July 21st, 1984, and Yamaki was blown away by what he saw. He was astonished by the characters, wowed by the details, timing, and movement of the animation. The difference between the primarily veteran staff, carried over from the Yamato days, Yamaki was depending on for Odin, and what he was witnessing on screen, crafted by the hands of the younger generation, was immeasurable. That Odin was a commercial and critical failure in its own time, and today remembered as an infamous and obscure piece of media says a lot. especially next to the storied heights of Macross, released the same year as Urusei Yatsura 2, Beautiful Dreamer, and Nausicaa of the Valley of the Wind. Do You Remember Love, an adaptation of the 1982 TV series, was one of the towering milestones of the early days of otaku culture, and is nowadays looked back upon with immense fondness. But Yamaki didn't need magazine rankings, box office returns, or hindsight for that realization. The lesson he needed to learn was clear upon first impression. The children of the Tokusatsu and anime booms were of age and brought with them tremendous new talent to the industry. Although he sought to evoke the past, Yamaki simply didn't want an unremarkable retread of it. And to avoid that, he realized he needed the help of the younger generation if he was going to achieve something special that had never been done before. Yamaki knew he wanted to make a mecha anime, and he knew that he was going to recruit young talent to help him do it. So the next matter was figuring out what to exert this energy on. He briefly considered something Tetsujin 28 related, but quickly decided the series already had enough adaptations. Besides the 1960 live-action series, there was the 1963 anime series, and at the time, there had been a second anime series only several years earlier, in 1980. Plus, by the time Yamaki got the first episode of his Giant Robo out in 1992, another Tetsujin 28 anime series hit Japanese airwaves only months earlier that same year. So, Yamaki figured that another Yokoyama property could use some attention. Its name was... Unlike a number of its peers from decades earlier, Giant Robo had yet to receive an anime adaptation, nor was there one coming down the pipeline. Ultraman had multiple anime by this point, those being 1979's The Ultraman, and the various installments of Ultraman Kids starting in 1984. So, as far as a classic mecha-related property that had not been an anime yet was concerned, Giant Robo made sense. And, based on a 2016 Forbes interview with Makoto Kobayashi, the OVA's mech designer, it sounds like it didn't take long to come to that conclusion. The Giant Robo OVA was done at the same time where they were working on Yamato back in the 80s. At the time, they were working on the story for Yamato Resurrection, and the producer bought an awful lot of red and blue paints to prepare for the project. Then suddenly, Nishizaki canceled the whole thing, which meant there was a lot of leftover blue and red paint. So, they approached me about whether they could do something with Giant Robo, as the main mecha was red and blue. So this was around 85 or 86, and TBS were going to do this as a TV series. Again, this got canceled, but it resurfaced as an OVA, and they took around 2 years to do the first episode. So, to put it really simply, Giant Robo was a byproduct of when Nishizaki tried to resurrect Yamato and failed. Kobayashi's artwork dating back to early 1986 supports this account, and, based on said art, Giant Robo's redesign appears to have been decided upon almost from the start. And so, while Yamaki had his subject, now he needed the means to make it happen. The advent of VHS and Laserdisc in the late 70s opened the door to a new market, and that market aggressively expanded throughout the next decade until before long entertainment had a viable outlet outside of theater and television. Come 1984, the OVA was born. OVAs, or original video animation, were straight-to-video animation boasting lavish production value and the ability to take risks their TV and theatrical counterparts could not. Artists could get as sensual, or as violent, or as cerebral as they pleased, and take as much time to work on their projects as they wanted. And as a result, OVAs were a hotbed for experimental works. Many beloved anime came out of this environment. Megazone 23, Gunbuster, Bubblegum Crisis, the list goes on. While it might seem these would have been the perfect conditions for Yamaki's Giant Robo to thrive, the amount of money he wanted was a little on the problematic side of things. At the time, the average 30-minute OVA cost roughly 20 million yen, but Yamaki was asking for 50 million yen per episode, for a project that might be anything from one 70-minute episode to potentially several episodes at least 40 minutes in length. So, for the longest time, it was a price tag no one wanted to touch. 3 years passed as Yamaki attempted to secure funding for Giant Robo, and during that time he produced another anime, Yoroshiki Doji, Legend of the Overfiend, an adaptation of an erotic horror manga that helped to put tentacle hentai on the map. So what changed? Well, the 80s OVA boom coincided with the Japanese bubble economy, a period of insane economic prosperity that saw more money circulating than anyone knew what to do with. And naturally, this money found its way into the entertainment industry. By the late 80s, studio executives and consumers alike were throwing money at even slightly interesting ideas. So, as the 80s became the 90s and the bubble intensified, more and more OVAs saw the light of day, and this is where Yamaki got his big break. It was actually while working on Legend of the Overfiend that Yamaki caught the attention of Amuse Video president, Miyashita Matsuyuki. Yamaki made his case to Matsuyuki and won him over, securing the unconditional financial support of both Amuse Video and Bandai, and thus the chance to make his long gestating vision a reality. The question was now, who would direct this project? Though it wasn't really a question at all. There happened to be a rising star who caught Yamaki's eye once before, Yasuhiro Imagawa. Imagawa is probably best known for reinventing a then Alien Gundam series with Mobile G Fighter Gundam, and reinvigorating the Getter Robo series with Shin Getter Robo. But in the late 80s, he was a relative newcomer to the anime directing scene. Imagawa first caught Yamaki's attention because of 1983's Aura Battler Divine, a fantasy mecha series which Imagawa helped to storyboard and direct. This led to Yamaki inviting the young artist to work on the Space Battleship Yamato continuation projects, where Imagawa continued to impress Yamaki with his output. During the transition between the aborted Space Battleship Yamato spin-offs and Giant Robo OVA, Imagawa took up Sunrise's offer to direct the 1987 anime adaptation of competitive cooking series Mr. Ajiko, and it's with this show that Imagawa really made waves. Young directors were a rarity in the industry, and in only his mid-20s, Imagawa delivered a huge hit with Mr. Ajiko, making him one of the hottest commodities on the market. So with this feat, Imagawa had knocked Yamaki off his feet, and again found himself snatched up by the ambitious producer, this time put in charge of the Giant Robo anime. Imagawa, as a lifelong fan of the property, was ecstatic. In fact, Imagawa was a bigger fan of Mitsuteru Yokoyama than Yamaki. In a 1994 interview, Imagawa confessed, "Giant Robo is built on the foundations of my feelings for the manga and the live-action television series. Giant Robo is the animation I've dreamed of making my entire life. It's full of me. If anything, it's me." One of the most notable aspects of the Giant Robo OVA was that it brought together a wide variety of characters from across Yokoyama's illustrious career. Up until now, at least in the Western world, it has been widely reported that basically the only elements the OVA could use were Daisaku and Giant Robo. Everything else from the previous versions of Giant Robo was off limits, leading Imagawa to find a creative workaround. Some people have even speculated that Toei denied Phoenix Entertainment, the studio behind the OVA, the rights to remake the live-action series, demanding too much money for the use of the Tokusatsu original elements. However, upon reaching out to producer Yasuhito Yamaki, it seems none of this was quite the case. Yamaki graciously responded to inquiry and revealed that the direction the OVA went was not based on any restrictions or interference from Toei or anyone for that matter. It was a decision made by him and Imagawa. A few other sources back this. One, in the previously mentioned 1994 interview, Imagawa was asked why the OVA was so different from the live-action version, and he explained, "Although the Giant Robo TV show and manga were developed concurrently, they're both very different. They have their own content, their own shape. The thing about the manga is, it's out of print. Yokoyama's original story isn't around anymore, but the live-action version is. My thought was that there was room for another, completely different Giant Robo, one which could be animated. Seeing as the manga has become a phantom, I felt I was free to make a third incarnation." Second, there's a retrospective interview in which Imagawa said,
今回そのジャイアントロボやられる時ってあまりそっちには引きずられなかったというか、もう
それはね、これは日比さんなんかとか、特撮マニアなんかの方はね、にはどう思われるかわかんないんだけど、私はその過去のそういうものに対して全然執着持たない口なんですよ。だからジャイアントロボの実写は実写で楽しかったね、面白かったねで、今はそれをやりたいとは全然なんだか思わないんですよ。だからイコールのものっていうなんか好きじゃなくて。だから最初とにかくジャイアントロボの実写ができるじゃなくて、ジャイアントロボっていうそのロボットでプロデューサーからね、泣けるもん作ってくれって言われて、分かりましたっつって、それだけなんですよ。だから全然違っちゃっていいのねっていう、で一緒は嫌よっていう感じ。
Third, in an interview in the 30th anniversary book from December 2022, Yasuhito Yamaki states, "If you remake a famous work from the past, you have to change the impression of the work drastically to surpass the original. So I thought that if I could leave a very different impression from the aimed at children contents of the live-action version, I could make a better work than the original." So where did the idea come from to use characters from other Yokoyama properties? Well, Yamaki was simply interested in having characters vaguely inspired by characters from other Yokoyama works, something akin to Osamu Tezuka's star system, based on the Hollywood Golden Age practice of reusing the same actors across different works, in this case, reusing character designs. However, Imagawa wanted to take it a step further. He wanted to use the actual characters, or get as close to the actual characters as possible. But what characters are those? Well, while he was famous for popularizing mecha, Yokoyama wasn't a one-trick pony. Over the course of his long career, he successfully put a spin on everything from magical girls to historical fiction, influencing modern creative icons including the men behind works like Akira and JoJo's Bizarre Adventure, and Imagawa hoped to tap into that rich legacy. So, with Yokoyama's blessing, the new Giant Robo would pull elements from across Yokoyama's career. Those titles included, but were not limited to, Akagage, Babel 2, Mars, Romance of the Three Kingdoms, Tetsujin 28, The Water Margin, and of course, Giant Robo. These characters, while more or less retaining their respective looks, were recontextualized to fit the needs of Imagawa's epic. Sally the Witch, from the manga and anime series of the same name, was repurposed into Sunny the Magician. Amusingly, Sunny was Sally's pre-production name before potential legal action by Sony forced Yokoyama to change it. Several of the 8 robots from Mars, a 1976 apocalyptic mecha manga series, make some form of an appearance in Giant Robo, as do 2 major characters, Alberto and Ivan. The OVA even mixes and matches some elements. Giant Robo sports a unicorn emblem on his forehead, a possible reference to the unicorns from the Tokusatsu series. Also, Wagner's Eye is a cross between a 6 Gods robot from Mars and Gammons, another character from the Giant Robo Tokusatsu series. And a whole lot more time could be spent making connections to Yokoyama canon. Quite a bit was stuffed in here. But anyway, with the Super Smash Bros.-like cast of Yokoyama's works assembled, much like he would do with Gundam a few years later, Imagawa and his team of talented artists completely reinvented Giant Robo, and the results? Its first episode hitting stores on July 22, 1992, Giant Robo, The Day the Earth Stood Still, traded the dated effects of the live-action series for state-of-the-art animation and the lanky goofball older brother figure for a sexy anime babe with a tragic past. The OVA is faithful to its roots, starring a young boy in short shorts who controls a giant robot with a wristwatch and works within the International Police Organization to combat BF, once again an earthbound terrorist organization pursuing the same old dream of world domination. Yet the OVA also confidently forges its own path, featuring superpowered characters, partaking in over-the-top Hong Kong cinema-inspired action, and a plot involving a phantom from the past who threatens to shroud the world in darkness. Better yet, Giant Robo, The Day the Earth Stood Still, with its subtitle borrowed from a classic 50s sci-fi film, is an ambitious tale. It explores the purpose, failures, and promises of science, the complex nature of relationships between parent and child, past and present, whether happiness can be achieved without sacrifice, and the sorrow of others not understanding their true feelings. The bond between boy and machine, already heartwarming in the Tokusatsu series, is given extraordinary new life. Little was made of Daisuke's age in relation to supporting characters in past versions of Giant Robo. However, the age gap, further highlighted by Daisuke's lack of superpowers compared to his adult companions, demands attention here and adds a lot to the heartfelt coming-of-age story the OVA has to tell. Yet what is text on the page without its execution? Fortunately, blessed with a massive budget and plenty of time to realize their vision, seemingly no expense was spared in making an anime epic. As he promised he would years earlier, Yamaki turned to an all-star collection of young talent to breathe new life into icons of old. And here's a small sample of that talent. The mechs were handled by Makoto Kobayashi. Kobayashi was someone Imagawa worked with years earlier on 1985's Mobile Suit Zeta Gundam, a show Kobayashi designed several mechs for, and he had since made a name for himself by directing anime such as 1988's Dragon's Heaven. Akihiko Yamashita, who would later go on to become a famous Studio Ghibli veteran that you can thank for the Dreamy How and other Ghibli characters since Spirited Away, oversaw the animation direction and old-school character designs. Yamashita was assisted in those duties by Toshiyuki Kiboka, whose resume at the time included designing the characters for early Studio Gainax projects, such as Gunbuster and Nadia, and later included designing the characters of the Idolmaster, and more recently directing the Berserk Golden Age trilogy films. The key animation for most of the opening scenes was animated by Hideaki Anno, who only a few years later would change the anime industry forever with Neon Genesis Evangelion, and these openings feature his fondness for thin lasers wreaking havoc. What fondness, you ask? Anno's longtime partner in crime and special effects legend Shinji Higuchi, the man who shortly afterwards would take Tokusatsu films to new heights with Gamera, also found himself involved with Giant Robo, helping to storyboard the 3rd episode of the OVA series. Finally, there's a rousing score by Masamichi Amano, and his music is performed by the Warsaw Philharmonic Orchestra, starting a trend in anime that will continue for at least a decade. Giant Robo the animation was plagued by various issues throughout its production. Firstly, having to split his time between both Giant Robo and Mobile Fighter G Gundam, Imagawa was extremely busy, which ended up being a source of delays. Second, Giant Robo the animation is every bit as expensive as it looks, and as the production ballooned in scale and scope, going from what was initially planned to be a single 70-minute OVA to 7 roughly 40 to 60-minute episodes that took several years to complete and exceeded 500 million yen in expenses, the filmmakers were forced to find additional means to fund their project. This is what led to Giant Robo Genrei Special, a 3-episode miniseries starring leading Lady Genrei as its main character. The side project took a more humorous and sensual approach to the material, putting the cast into unique situations and expanding on characterization. The project initially did well, however, it apparently ended up being expensive to produce and thus not all that profitable. That is likely why one of two concepts for a planned 4th episode was converted into an audio drama, and with that, the Genrei special came to a close. Ultimately, while not a flop by any means, Giant Robo's domestic sales weren't good enough to keep sponsors interested, and despite a tease of a much larger story to come, the OVA came to a close with its 7th episode. But it is worth noting that, unlike many OVAs from its era that ended prematurely and never gave their stories proper closure, Giant Robo's OVA did resolve its immediate concerns, and since cliffhangers of sorts is an Imagawa storytelling preference, the series might have ended the way it did, regardless of how well it performed. Sales apparently fared better overseas, and allegedly, Imagawa once said, if the series had sold as well in Japan as it did in the US, more could have been made. Regardless, it's kept alive by a passionate fanbase. Almost a quarter of a century since its final episode, the OVA consistently attracts sold-out crowds for its theatrical issues, and is viewed today with great reverence by those who remember it. Basically, the 90s OVA is now the face of Giant Robo, representing the series in video games and other media, and is likely owed some credit for the wave of retro-themed anime that followed in its wake. In the roughly 10 years following Giant Robo's debut episode, there was Metropolis, the 2003 Astro Boy reboot, Blue Submarine No. 6, Super Atragon, Kikaider the Animation, Steam Boy, and The Big O. A lot of Giant Robo's crew would even work on some of the aforementioned projects, namely The Big O, and Imagawa would later get another chance to reimagine a Yokoyama property with a 2004 anime TV adaptation of Tetsujin 28. But arguably, the OVA's most important legacy is just being an amazing piece of media. Giant Robo, The Day the Earth Stood Still, is a bold reimagining of a source material, a heartfelt tribute to one of the most influential voices in manga and anime, and a well-crafted highlight of its medium and entertainment period. And with that, Giant Robo's 20th century history came to a close. But that of course wasn't the end of Giant Robo. A new century brought with it new challenges and new opportunities. An anniversary short film which happened to be the first project in any medium that faithfully reproduced the original manga. The animated TV series which spawned from the short and took the series in a completely new direction. And a rumored live-action film by Akioji Soji, the visual maverick of the Ultra series. So all of that is a story for another time. Finally, a special thanks to my patrons, Brandon DeReal, Monkey Pant, Nick Lenz, Puppy Buds, Austin Trench, Gracio, and Michael Stevens. And a very special thanks to my biggest supporter, Zealous Fervor. Thanks for doing what you do. Lastly, shout out to Daimos Z, aka the world's biggest Giant Robo fan, and to everyone else who helped make this video possible. And with that, take care until next time.